welcome back to Crime Besties for episode number 17 this week. Hello, Emma.
Hey, Meg, how's it going?
Good, how are you doing? Because you've been crook.
Yeah, we've had to skip a recording last week. Not that you guys will know anything about that because it'll just flow into one another. But yeah, I've been really, really unwell. There's so much going around. I was a little bit smug because we've kind of gotten through winter without having any serious, like I've had a mild cold and I think that was about the worst of it.
Yeah.
But no, I really got struck down for
you were down
a week.
For count.
Yeah. Belly surfaced for 5 days. So anyway, I'm feeling a lot better now. Still trying to get some of my energy back, but
we'll forgive you.
Thanks.
We'll take it.
How have you been? How have the last couple of weeks been for you?
Missing my bestie, but we have survived. No, it's been good. No, but not too bad a week. Been busy, of course, with all the usual stuff, but pretty good.
That's good. During my downtime, I had a bit of time to, listen to a few different podcasts and I was just lying there on my deathbed, so as it were. And I came across this really cool podcast called Hysterical. It's a Wondery podcast, and I find they produce really good podcasts. If I'm looking for something, often I'll search for Wondery podcasts, and that's actually how I found this one. It's really interesting. It's about a very small cohort of kids come down with a tic and a bit like a sort of a Tourette syndrome type illness, and they don't know how it happened or, and the podcast kind of goes into the investigation of it and what the outcome is.
It's a true story?
It's true. It's absolutely true. Wow. It's based in Leroy, in New York.
Okay.
Really fascinating, really good listen, very well produced, great podcast.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to check it out. That sounds really
give
cool.
it a go.
Interesting.
Yeah. And while we're on shout outs for things, I just wanted to give a shout out today to, this lady is a school mum and we don't see that much of each other. Our kids are in the same year level, but, I'm down the other end of the school and I don't come across her very often. We are on the school council together. But a massive shout out to Kim. She's been really lovely in supporting us, and you had an interaction with Kim the other day too.
Yeah, because our kids aren't in the same year levels and things like that, so I don't know that well. I just know that you've pointed her out before, sort of thing to me, and coming out of the basketball the other day, and she bailed me up, going, "You don't know me, but I know you. You do the podcast," and I was like, "Oh, that's so gorgeous."
Yeah, she's so lovely. I love that sort of like women supporting women stuff. So
great.
Thanks so much, Kim. We really appreciate the support and the lovely feedback.
Yes, thank you. I just love that people are actually enjoying it, and as much as we are.
Yeah, and
so
people like Kim, she has no obligation to listen. So,
no.
unlike our husbands and families. So thanks, Kim. It means a lot. It really does.
Absolutely does. Yeah. I just had one thing to add to. I came across something just actually last night. It's actually a petition that I'm going to ask people to sign. If you are so inclined, but also you do need to be a Victorian resident of Australia to sign this petition. But a real call to arms, I guess, and this one. It's an interesting law that's only exists still in Victoria, and across the rest of the country, this law doesn't exist. So they're petitioning for this law to be removed in Victoria as well. It's very old, it's an outdated law, I think. So basically what the petition is around is this emergency management days that prisoners can claim in Victoria. And what this has resulted in actually at the moment is during the COVID lockdowns in Melbourne, which we were extensively locked down. We were the most locked down in all the country.
I think in the world. We were the most locked down city in the world.
It gives me a twitch. Yeah, big time. Which, we were all impacted outside of prisons in the free moving world. We were impacted by that, and, yes, there were certain compensations in place, but prisoners apparently can claim emergency management days, and COVID lockdowns were one of them, and they can claim as much as 4 days per 1 day of inconvenience off their sentence.
That blows my mind.
So basically, this is just in reference to COVID-19 that I'm speaking about here specifically, but this can be relating to. They can have, if there's industrial action, if there's some sort of disruption or deprivation that they are impacted by, or an emergency, they can claim days off of their sentence. But with the COVID lockdowns, that resulted in prisoners being able to claim in Victoria alone 360,000 days collectively off their sentences.
Whoa.
And that is equivalent to over 1,000 years of jail time being lessened for prisoners in Victoria.
Wow.
So basically, we can't do anything about that. That's in the past. But if we can remove this law, people who should be serving their sentences will need to serve their full sentences based on legal stuff rather than emergency lockdowns and things like that.
Or a day of inconvenience for a prisoner. Interesting.
Yeah. So if you, I will put the link to the petition in our show notes and on our socials as well. But if you are so inclined, please, and a Victorian resident, it has to be a Victorian resident. This petition's been done before, and Australia-wide people have got together and signed this petition, but the government will not look at it unless you are a Victorian resident.
Okay.
So they've had to redo the petition for that reason and just ask Victorian residents to sign. So, yeah, I'll pop it in the socials and our show notes, and please jump on and sign it if you're so inclined. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like an incredibly worthy cause. I mean, what's the point in having a sentence if they can just then be reduced for things? I mean, if you're thinking about lockdown, I mean, hello, we were imprisoned in our own homes.
Yeah, and we didn't commit murders.
Yeah,
and that's the other thing. It doesn't matter what you could. The only prisoner that it doesn't impact is terrorists.
Okay.
Murderers, rapists, robbers, anything else, it impacts. So, unless you're a terrorist, you get the advantage of that. That being able to be reduced on your sentence.
I'll keep an eye out in the show notes, and
sure.
Yeah, if you feel like giving it a go, jump on.
Thank you, everyone.
So, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, let's move into our case for today. So today we're going to talk about the Boston Strangler.
Yeah,
it's a very interesting case, and would find out at the end who thinks they caught the guy. Well, caught the guy, and who didn't. If they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, this one was a really new one for me. So I'd heard of the Boston Strangler.
Yeah.
And I thought I knew a little bit about the case, but it turns out I don't really think I knew that much. Now that we've looked into it a little bit more, I feel
like it is one of those cases where it's become so almost like pop culturalized that you know the term the Boston Strangler, but maybe don't know the ins and outs of the case.
Absolutely. That was that's my
because
experience.
Like, even I thought you'd love, I found there was a little quote of the Boston Strangler being used in The Sopranos.
Oh,
do you remember
it? No, I don't.
I loved it. It was gorgeous. It was Camilla and her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
You know, I just love that relationship between the two of them in that show. And it was the mother-in-law was like, you know, oh, who's that at the door? And Camilla goes, oh, Ma, it's the Boston Strangler. Stop panicking.
I don't remember that reference.
Yeah.
It's my favourite show of all time. I mean, there's a lot of references to pop culture. I know if you just have a look on the Wikipedia page for the Boston Strangler, there's like a whole page worth of references where it's been, referenced in movies and TV shows and stuff. So
for sure.
There's a lot about it in the vernacular, but I didn't know the ins and outs of this at all, and I didn't even know sort of the question marks around the case.
Yeah, for sure. No, I didn't realise all of that side of it either until I started looking into it more. So, I mean, I watched a little mini movie on it just to get because I just wanted some reference points, and that was the easiest way to kind of do that and to get sort of knowing that potentially wasn't all fact, but as it went on, it was actually quite factual, that one.
Yeah.
I know you watched the more recent movie, The Boston Strangler, with
Keira Knightley. Yeah, it's a really good movie if you're interested.
Yeah.
It's very, very well made. And there was a companion podcast that went with it, which was also called The Boston Strangler.
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting podcast that I listened to because the first few episodes are more about the actual crime and what happened, and then the last few episodes of the series was about how they made the movie.
Yeah.
So it was a bit of both. So there's some facts in there, but the movie seems to be quite true to real life events. So worth a watch if it's something that you're interested in, for sure. And it was only made last year in 2023, so it's a recent adaptation.
Yeah. And to be honest, when I've got into it, like the story of it is so interesting that you can very easily make a very easily watchable movie, that's entertaining because there's so many twists and turns to this.
Yeah.
To this case, because it was set back in the 60s. Well, I shouldn't say set back in the 60s. This is reality, people. It happened. It was the first case that we're looking at was in 1962 when this started. And I mean, so we didn't have the technologies back then of what we do now to solve cases. So it was, on the ground, the cops doing the cop work in terms of knocking on doors, finding witnesses. There wasn't DNA testing. There wasn't even fingerprinting in those days. So it was very difficult to find someone. I believe too, from what I was reading, that this is considered the first of modern time serial killer case.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's in America. Sorry, because Jack the Ripper is probably the most worldly known one. But the Boston Strangler is the first considered in America to be the first serial killer.
And that's why I think there was a lot of maybe conjecture around it, or people were not quite sure, because it was not like they'd seen anything like this before, or to have so many women murdered in very similar ways with very similar MOs.
Yeah. So they certainly weren't criminal profilers back in this stage either. I mean, although, to be honest, looking back through what the police did, they were profiling without knowing that's what it wasn't called that yet.
Absolutely. The FBI actually got it pretty right.
Yeah.
We'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, for sure.
So the Boston Strangler murders were attributed to a man named Albert DeSalvo. He was born on the 3rd of September in 1931. And he came from a very interesting upbringing. And I think this is something that we've talked about this. I mean, we're at episode 17. I reckon more than half of our episodes we've talked about the early life of these criminals and what they've gone through. And Albert DeSalvo is absolutely he's not an exception to the rule that he's had such a traumatic upbringing.
No, I mean, I'm sure with what you looked at, you would have seen some of the things that everywhere I went sort of mentioned a little bit more about what he was exposed to as a child.
Yeah.
And each bit I was like mortified more and more.
Yeah.
I mean, as I read somewhere that he was made to watch his mum have her teeth knocked out and then watch as his dad broke every single one of her fingers.
Apparently she was knocked out at the time.
Yeah.
Like he'd punched her so hard that her teeth were knocked out of her jaw.
Yeah.
And then he bent her fingers back and broke every single one of her fingers. His dad
but he forced the children to watch that too.
Yep.
Which is just... Ugh.
So his dad's name was Frank. Mm-hmm. He also brought prostitutes into the house and would perform absolutely revolting sexual acts and also make his wife and his children watch.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my God.
So when you look at who he became... Like, it makes sense, unfortunately. Like, doesn't it, really? Yeah. It's just, ugh.
Albert also had a history as a youngster of torturing animals, and his crime sprees kind of started with fairly low-level robberies, but, it obviously escalated very, very quickly as he grew up.
But having said all of that, when he was arrested... they did speak to obviously his wife and family, friends, all those sorts of things about who he was. And they all said he was a really lovely man. They did not actually suspect this of him, and that they knew of his past and things like that. But he was very much in his home life depicted a man of, I'm never going to let my family see what I saw. I'm going to break the cycle kind of attitude. And so instead of doing it in the home, he did it elsewhere. His wife said that he had the most loving relationship with his children. He was really beautiful with them and didn't want them experiencing anything of what he experienced. So there's this his entire personality is a contradiction in so many ways when we get into it.
We will get into that.
But yeah, he very much in his home life, he set up a very loving family life and had friends and family who, respected him. The only thing that stood out from his wife of what she commented on about him was that he had a very high sex drive that she struggled with a lot, particularly after having children and things, and that he didn't want to wait until she recovered and things like that she struggled with.
Yeah.
And that caused issues. But beyond that, which I'm not dismissing as being horrific and awful to probably live with, really, he was generally a good bloke.
Yeah, absolutely.
In home life.
Even his brother. So his brother's obviously grown up in the same environment as he has, and isn't a perpetrator of crime. It should be well known that I think he had there were 5 children in the family, and he's the only one that we know of that's committed these heinous crimes.
Yeah,
but his brother even says that that he would never have picked it. He you know, the police came to interview his brother and he's like, well, no, my brother would never do that. He doesn't have that personality. So even those, as you say, those closest to him, his wife, you would think behind closed doors in the privacy of their own home, if something was going to happen, it would happen.
Typically, that's where they do it. They're perpetrating. I mean, we always talk about, you know, even on this podcast about the whole fact that the first person you think of who's perpetrated a crime against a woman is typically in the household with them.
Their intimate partner.
They're someone that they know well.
Yeah.
You know, so this is a little bit out of the box on that he took it outside the family home. But obviously it was that whole, you know, oh no, you can't do that in your family life. You can't do that at home. I don't want my kids seeing what I saw. But it's like, how can I remove it? If I still had it in me, I have to do it somewhere else and have to get it out.
Yeah.
And so he's taken it out elsewhere, which I have no empathy for him in that
respect.
Absolutely
not. Absolutely not. Just to give a little bit of context as well to Boston at the time, this was around the time that JFK was murdered and he was a Bostonian.
Yes.
By the way, I love the Bostonian accent.
I literally have had it in my brain, like I'm bad at this, so my brain has literally had a Boston accent the entire last 2 weeks.
Do you then try and speak it and you can't speak it?
Yeah, Boston. I suck at it, like, you know.
In my head I can hear it, but then I try and say it and I'm like, oh, it does not come out like that at all.
Oh, no, because every podcast, everything I've listened to, every documentary I've watched, everything I've read, it's all in a Boston accent.
I know, right? But then, so this is completely an aside, total tangent here. But there's a movie that Ben Affleck was in, and he had to have a Boston accent.
Wasn't it Good Will Hunting?
Yes.
Yeah.
And apparently he worked with a dialect coach for like 12 months to try and get this Boston accent. And then he was like, I couldn't break it because as soon as I broke it, I couldn't then get it back.
Yeah.
So he lived for, I mean, you know, a bit of method acting, I guess. But I'm like, well, if it's good enough for Ben Affleck, maybe we should give some dialect coaching a go, Meg.
Oh, man. All I can do in a Boston accent is it's had.
Yeah.
It's had. It's all really had.
Yeah.
Don't come at me.
Oh, no, we're going to get some haters now.
Oh, totally. Oh, man. No, honestly, though, like, I know people always say they think like Australian accents are like sexy or whatever, and I'm like, I don't know how you do that. But I find a Boston accent,
yeah, it's nice. I don't hate it.
No, I do not hate it.
So JFK was murdered around this time, and it had a massive impact on Boston in particular.
Boston people really took it personally. They really took it hard. Really hard. Yeah.
So that just gives a little bit of, you know, where the city was at and the era that this was sort of set in. Yeah. So I guess we should flag there a little bit. Like we're saying, you know, Albert DeSalvo is like known as to being the Boston Strangler. However, there are question marks. So we will get to that. Yeah, that's it. There's question marks around it, and I think you've already alluded to the fact that there was not a lot of forensic evidence collected, and there was not a lot of things that these days we can then use to prove that he committed these murders.
Yeah.
So he was actually, well, I guess, do you want to start off with why he was originally imprisoned?
Yeah. So basically he was actually imprisoned for a completely separate reason. So a little bit of, I guess I'll go back a little bit. There was a particular police officer named Phil oh God, I'm going to ruin his name. Dinatello.
Yeah.
Dinatello. And he was an incredible detective. He was family, was all police officers. He sounds like he was a real determined detective. To the point where when he started his career, he was so determined to make it through and make it to detective as a young cop that he was told he had to go down on the street and they needed to arrest a purse snatcher that was, you know, really terrorizing the community. And so he went down and cross-dressed with another cop, and they ended up arresting these purse snatchers by doing this cross-dressing and standing there with their purses. And then, you know, and then the purse snatcher would come and take and grab their purse, and then he'd run after them and tackle them to the ground and get them. So he was incredible at his job. He was really, he was out there to get the baddies, you know.
Yeah.
I think one other one was him and one other cop, so just the two of them. There was a gang of about 5 or so young sort of teenager, like older teenager kind of kids that were really terrorizing the community. And they so these two cops went and they actually tackled and beat up these 5 gang members and arrested them and got them off the streets. Like,
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, he was a pretty incredible cop. Like, really wanted he wanted the baddies off the street.
Yeah.
So he
good old fashioned
police work sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so he obviously built his way up to detective, but this is the case, the Boston Strangler, that he was handed that really got him in his career. Like, this really annoyed him that he couldn't find who it was that was perpetrating these horrific crimes. I mean, the women were scared in Boston.
So there were 13 women over about 20 months.
Yeah.
Attributed to the what Boston is known as the Boston Strangler now.
Yeah. So women were getting angry with the police for not having taken someone off the street. So it actually got to a point where the murders had occurred, and he was still trying to find out who it was after they'd already ranked up 11 or so at this point.
Yep.
And he actually had a heart attack. He was that stressed in his job and everything. He had a heart attack and was put in hospital. And whilst he was in hospital, he happened to be put into the hospital where one of the victims, Sophie Clark, used to work. And whilst he was in hospital, he thought, I'm going to keep working on this case. And so it didn't slow him down at all. But as he was working on the case, the nurses were coming in and, checking on him and everything. And he would ask the nurses, hey, did you know Sophie Clark? Because she worked here. And they would freak out. They would absolutely freak out at this idea of Sophie Clark and what happened to her. And after a number of times, he ended up getting a phone call in the hospital from someone who let him know, stop asking the nurses about Sophie, because Albert DeSalvo raped one of the nurses and they're terrified that he's going to come and get them, that you've got to stop talking about Sophie Clark. They relate that to him and you've got to stop. And he was like, whoa. That's a name I haven't heard of. And they had looked at thousands of people for this case. So that was a new name to him. He was like, well, I love a new name, and someone chase him down and see who he is. And it turned out at this point in time, he was already arrested and in prison for other rapes. So that kind of lined up that this could potentially be him. But his boss said, drop it. It's not Albert DeSalvo, because he was in prison for the 2 years of the Boston Strangler murders. That's why we haven't looked at him. He was in jail. So Phil Donatelli went and did the legwork, though. He was like, I'm not dropping this. I'm not listening to just being told that he was in jail, because this is not a computer system where you can just type in someone's name and go, oh, that's where he was. He was in prison at the time. It was all rooms filled with files. He had to go along and find the file of Albert DeSalvo and pull it all out, went through it, going through who this guy was. The fact that he'd been arrested for these other rapes was all in there. That's all great. And then he found, finally, that he was not in jail in 1962 through to 1964. He was, in fact, released early.
Yeah. So I think he originally was it like an 18-month sentence, and he was out in 5 months or something? It was something ridiculous.
So it was good behaviour.
Yes, because he was so well behaved. Yep. Because he only perpetrated when he was raping these women.
Yep.
At this point, it was just rape.
Yeah.
So what he would do is he would pose as a repair man.
Yep.
So a lot of the women attested to the fact that he was wearing these green work pants,
overall kind of
sort of things.
Outfits, yeah.
And he'd knock on the door and say, oh, the superintendent of the building asked me to come and paint your wall, or asked me to fix your tap or whatever. And he'd come in and he would, obviously then perpetrate crimes against these women. Another thing that he would do is he would follow women. So follows what he would, I guess, assume to be single women. He'd follow them to their house, knock on their door, and he'd be like, oh, I'm a model scout, model agent scout. I need to measure you up and see whether you're appropriate for one of our campaigns, and I can get you a modelling gig. And he would literally touch them up while he was measuring their thighs, and he'd make them put leotards or swimsuits on so that he could really get up there. And they said he touched everything.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how the crimes started. When he was doing that, he was known as the measuring man.
Yep.
And then
the repairman was the green man.
The green man.
I love all these names.
I know. But so it was for those crimes. I mean, I say they're lesser. I mean, they're lesser crimes in that, okay, yes, he didn't murder them, but he's certainly sexually assaulted all of these women.
Yeah.
And he ended up going to prison for that.
And there were witnesses to those crimes too. So he was able to be identified, because obviously these women survived those things. So he was able to be identified. He definitely did those crimes. There is no ifs, buts about that.
He confessed to that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, not that we'll get to the fact whether his confessions mean anything or not. But He confessed to them. There was one incident I heard of a woman who she really quick thinker. He'd knocked on her door, and this was one of the Green Man sort of incidents. And he came inside, and she said she just got like this really weird feeling. And so she was like, "Oh, I'm just going to go and get my husband. He's sleeping in the room next door." And with that, Albert left the building, but went across the hall and then perpetrated a sexual assault on the neighbour. When he was ready and raring to go, there was nothing going to stop him.
No.
You know, obviously he's trying to lessen the impact if there was a male in the house, but you know, even still, he was just relentless.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was in prison for these Green Man and
Measuring
Man crimes. And so, yeah, Phil De Natale pinned him and kind of went, right, it's possible he is the culprit of the Boston Strangler murders too. I mean, it sort of fitted as well in that respect.
So I think he got out of prison less than a month before the first Boston Strangler murder.
That's right. Yeah.
So the timing really did match up.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just kind of all the planets kind of aligned. And thank God Phil De Natale did what he did and was as dogged as he was, because it meant the end of what was an absolutely horror 20-odd months in Boston.
Yes.
Women were scared. There was so much going on that, you know, they were scared to be alone and walking home. And all of the crimes of the Boston Strangler were committed on single women. Mm-hmm. The thing that I find interesting about it is there was no particular look to the women.
Well, that's
no particular age to the women.
Yeah.
You know, they were black women. The youngest was 19. The eldest was 85.
Yeah.
That's
where
a
question
really
marks begin,
one.
though, isn't it?
Well, it does.
Yeah.
It does.
So he wasn't in prison in 1962.
Yes.
For those Green Man crimes. That was what he was in prison for when Phil De Natale put it all together and went, I think he's the man.
Oh, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so he was in prison originally when they went, oh no, he was in jail, it couldn't have been him, but he got out early. He was in prison for, again, further other crimes that he had perpetrated. So when Phil De Natale had gone, I think he's our bloke, by that point he was already in prison. No, he wasn't actually in prison. He was in Bridgewater State Hospital. So they basically had determined that he was insane already, and that when they were assessing him for that, and so that he could maybe not be put on trial for his case, his crimes, he would basically claim insanity.
Yeah. So the diagnosis. So he was 33 years old at this time, and his diagnosis was sociopathic personality disorder marked by sexual deviation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what he was in, like, this was the diagnosis in Bridgewater at the time, which was basically a prison hospital.
Yeah. So his cellmate at Bridgewater was a guy by the name of George Nassar. Now, he's an interesting character.
Isn't he?
So George Nassar was also a criminal.
Criminally
insane. So he was linked to the mob. He was actually kind of their go-to man for all violence and murder that they needed. When he was arrested himself, in his house, they found police uniforms, doctor's uniforms, repairman uniforms, things that maybe if he wore, a woman might allow that person into their home without too much of a question.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. He also lived at the time in the south end of Boston, which is exactly in the middle of where all of the Boston Strangler women were killed.
Yep.
So quite in the zone of all those sorts of things going on. So this man, in some ways, had some characteristics, etc., that could also put him on the radar for being the Boston Strangler. And so these two men end up in a cell together. And George had a very interesting lawyer named F. Lee Bailey, which we may remember that he was one of the many lawyers that O.J. Simpson also used. He was a very famous lawyer in the States. He's written a really great book called The Defense Never Rests, worth a read. So he was his lawyer, and he was like, there seems to have been a bit of a push from George to Albert DeSalvo to confess to the Boston Strangler murders. To basically the idea was that they could then make some money out of this.
Yeah, because there was a reward out.
Yeah.
Because the public was so concerned about this, as we were saying, it's the first serial killer case known really within the United States. Families, women were terrified. So the state decided to, or the city, sorry, decided to put up a reward for any information that would lead to the capture of the Boston Strangler or the confession or whatever, the conviction of the Boston Strangler.
Yeah.
So George decided he might like to tuck into that little nest egg.
Yeah.
And, I think he was fairly reward motivated in...
That, and it was very much noted in many places where I was looking that he was an incredibly intelligent man.
Yes, I believe
very
so.
intelligent man. And he knew that Albert DeSalvo was a family man and very strongly a family man. So he was able to manipulate a little bit on that, and he encouraged Albert at the point saying that you're going to jail for the rest of your life, no matter what. But based on these rapes that you've committed, you're in jail for the rest of your life.
Which ended up being true.
Yeah. So your poor family are going to be left high and dry without you now. If we claim this money, like, and split it sort of thing, like by you confessing, that'll set your family up and make sure that they're all taken care of. So I'm just planting a seed that maybe George Nassau was the Boston Strangler.
So I think the whole thing is that perhaps he's given Albert enough information that Albert's able to then use in a confession and things that only the murderer would know when Albert's confessed to these murders.
Yeah.
But then, more things come to light a little bit later on that makes us know that, Albert actually was involved.
He was involved, yeah.
We don't know to what extent and whether every single one of these 13 murders was actually attributable to Albert.
Yeah.
But, that remains to be seen. I definitely think that George, there's too much coincidence for me to think that George wasn't involved in some way in some of these murders.
Yeah.
And he knew things as well. And I know they would talk back and forth, but he knew things that Albert didn't necessarily know about certain murders.
Yep.
And, putting it all together, crazy.
It had already been out in the media and by the police connecting, kind of going, now, is there one person perpetrating these crimes? Because there was absolute copycats as well, that the cops had found that there were murders where, like, they'd arrive at the scene and they would have that signature of which was a piece of the woman's clothing tied around their neck, usually a nylon stocking or a scarf or something, and tied in a particular bow, which was released in the media. So people knew that was a signature of these crimes. But there were certainly murders where, this woman's been shot. Yep. And then a bow's been tied around her neck to try and cover it up to be like, it must be another one of those Boston Strangler murders. Oh no, it was her husband. Yeah. There was certainly murders around the city that there was, no, that's not the Boston Strangler. So they're certainly not on this list that we talk of, like 11 to 13 murders that are attributed to the Boston Strangler. They were able to eliminate those as being attributed to those crimes very easily.
Yeah.
But then are there certain ones on this list that we have of attributing to the Boston Strangler that maybe also could be more than one person committing these crimes?
Yeah. I think there's enough difference in MO to make that really likely.
Yeah.
So an FBI profiler much later. So this is, I think, might have even been in the early 2000s, this FBI profiler looked at all of the crimes and the case notes, and they came out and basically said, you're putting together so many different patterns that it's inconceivable behaviourally that all of these actions could fit one individual.
Yeah.
And so, if you're looking at one person committing all these crimes, like there were certain murders where a broom handle had been used to sexually assault the victim, and then in other cases that wasn't what happened.
It was actually the first 5 murders who were all older women. Yep. So the first, Anna Slessor was 55, and then Mary Mullen was 85. Nina Nichols was 68.
Yep.
Followed by Helen Blake, who was 65. Ida Erger was 75. And then Jane Sullivan was 67. So all 7 of those murders were older women, white, and they had been sexually assaulted with objects.
That's right.
They were not raped and penetrated with a penis.
Yep.
There was no semen left in the scene. So it's not until you get to Sophie Clark,
Yes.
who was 20 years of age, a black woman, and she was raped, not assaulted with a foreign object.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a real change in MO in that one.
Or is that an escalation?
Yes, and that's
that's where I think they don't know.
No, but there is a definite shift in
Absolutely.
it. And so from then on, it kind of jumps around a little bit with each case.
And there are then multiple ages and different ethnicities in terms of the victims for the remaining however many 5, 6, 7 victims, 6 victims.
6,
culminating in his youngest victim of 19 years of age, Marianne Sullivan. This one's a really interesting one because Marianne's family, so the podcast that I listened to, the one that was sort of aligning with the movie, they actually interviewed Marianne's family.
Yes, yep.
In it. Actually, maybe that was the Stranglers podcast, was it?
There's a
on Spotify.
There's her nephew has written a book who about it all, and he's been quite an activist in trying to solve it.
Yeah, he's the one I heard interviewed.
Yeah.
He wanted this crime solved. So they were working with the Bostonian police, and they ended up getting familial DNA, so from DeSalvo's nephew. And
can I ask how they got that? Because I think they just followed him and pinched his water bottle or something, did they?
I believe so.
Why wouldn't they just ask him for it?
I don't know. Maybe they were too worried that he'd say no.
But then they can still follow him and pinch something. I feel like you should ask first.
Yeah, probably. I don't know whether they did or not, actually. Maybe they did.
Maybe
Who knows?
I don't know.
Anyway.
It just got me. I was like, why wouldn't you just approach him?
But they didn't. Anyway, so they've then basically, with the familial DNA and Mary Sullivan's DNA, and they had semen that was able to be collected from Mary Sullivan's body at the time.
On a blanket, I think, from the scene.
To her. Yep.
Yeah.
And they put it together and it was like 99.99%. But what they decided to then do was exhume DeSalvo's body.
Yeah.
Because by this stage he was dead. We'll get to that in a second. And to confirm, like, literally without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, it wasn't one. It can never be 100%, but it was like 99.999999999.
Well, I think it was
1 or something.
1 in 200 million,
50 million or
like
something.
Huge.
Yeah.
It was like, well, this is the guy.
There's no chance that it wasn't.
Yeah.
So we know for sure that
he
DeSalvo definitely killed and raped Mary Sullivan.
Yes.
Marianne Sullivan.
Yeah.
What we don't know is whether he perpetrated the other 12 odd.
Yeah.
12 or 10, depending on
what you
believe and what the crimes. So it's still up there. It's still open as to whether he's committed the other crimes.
Yeah. So because there was some interesting ones on the list of the victims. Even like Sophie Clark, there's a question over whether or not she was one of the Boston Strangler victims, because she was seeing a guy by the name of Bob Payton at the time of her murder, who was a very odd guy. He had taken her out. I don't think she was that keen on him. And she had a fiance. So, but this guy had taken her out just, and she'd gone as a friend kind of thing like this. But this guy was very keen on her, this Bob Payton. And everyone was like, he's such a creep. He's real weird. And the police did question him, and he ended up failing 2 polygraphs. Now, not that you can submit that as evidence. So obviously he wasn't arrested, but there's definitely question marks over whether or not he committed that crime.
Yep.
Another one that is quite questionable is Patricia Bassett.
Yeah.
So she was 23, and her murder took place on December 31, 1962. Now, she was a young secretary working in a company, and a guy of the name of Jules Rothman was the vice president of the company, and she was working as his sort of secretary at the time. He was meant to pick her up that morning, and he went by and knocked on the door, and she didn't answer, and so he went on to work. He got to work and felt a little bit guilty and was kind of like, she hasn't rocked up. Where is she? I'll go check on her. So he rocked up, got the janitor, and asked him to help him get into the apartment. And from what the janitor said, he walked into the apartment, walked straight back out again and said, quote, "She's dead. Sorry, I'll get it right. I'll find the exact quote so that I can say it correctly. Where are we? Yes, she's dead and there's stockings around her neck." Okay. So that's what the janitor said. He said by just walking in and walking out again. And the janitor saw him do that. Turns out Jules Ruffman was having an affair with Patricia Bessette, and he had a wife and kids. And it turned out that she was also 1 month pregnant.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and he knew that she was pregnant too, because he had been asking around some friends and colleagues around how he could get a legal abortion.
Wow.
So it was known that he knew.
Okay.
So, but not only that, the difference of this death was that the way the body was placed.
Yeah.
So she was many of the women were placed very not nicely at all, like quite exposed, all those sorts of things. Whereas this body was sort of tucked up into her bed almost. She had blankets pulled right up to the point where when that man walked in and walked out again, he would not have known that there were stockings around her neck.
That's it.
You couldn't see it. So it was the one body that...
I thought he didn't even walk in far enough that he would have been... Like, you couldn't have just walked a few steps into her apartment and seen her. So I guess the inference is that he already knew she was dead.
He already knew that she was dead and already knew that there were stockings around her neck.
Exactly.
So as we say...
And the fact that she was so covered...
Yes.
I mean, we've spoken about this on previous podcasts as well. It suggests that somebody cared enough to do that and cover her up.
Whereas the other victims were not placed like that by any means, like the complete opposite of that.
Absolutely. You can go and have a look at crime scene photos. They're in some of them are in really explicit positions and there's nothing covering them. Like it's absolutely horrific.
Awful. Yeah. So there's some question marks. Those two stand out for me out of that list of the victims as to being whether or not they're probably the least that I would attribute to the Boston Strangler MO.
Agreed.
But there's also then that shift of younger women coming into it later when originally it was all older women.
Yeah.
And that's where I kind of go, I feel like maybe there was two people. I mean, if we eliminate those two entirely out of the list, like that they were
so we go back
potentially.
To 11. Yep.
And then the rest of them, I sort of go, I think the older women may have been, say, George Nassar.
Yeah.
And then the younger ones might have been Albert DeSalvo.
Yeah.
Like,
because we know Albert DeSalvo
definitely
at least killed the 19-year-old Marianne.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Both had opportunity. Both were in the right place at the right time. Both have pasts that would be suggestive of something like this and escalations that would potentially be leading to this. I mean, George Nassar had committed murders, rapes, burglaries, he'd assaulted people. Like, he had a rap sheet, that would absolutely potentially point to this as well.
Yeah.
So what actually happened was, when Albert and George were in the prison hospital together, they've decided then that Albert's going to confess. I mean, let's go down that pathway. Yep. Albert has then confessed to these Boston Strangler murders, and the police are asking him questions. So they've obviously released a lot of information to the public and to the media. Yeah. We'll get to that in a minute because that's a really fascinating side of the story.
Yeah, I want to hear what you've got on that.
Yeah. But so they've released certain information, but they haven't released everything. So they're wanting information that only the killer would know.
Yeah.
And Albert fits the bill in some ways. Like, he's got some information, certainly about types of objects that were used to penetrate the last few victims, positioning of, like, the bed, for example, in a room. Like, they were like, all right, describe the room. You walk into it, what's where? What's sitting where is the furniture? There's suggestion that the police fed him some of that information.
Yeah. Have you listened to some of the tapes?
Yeah.
I agree with that take on it. I mean, they say that sort of it broke protocol in how you interview somebody.
They were definitely suggestive in what they were like. So the couch, this one over here, was that the couch?
Yeah.
And he's like, oh yeah, that was the couch. Oh yeah, no, it was on that wall.
Apparently, I think there was the one particular police officer they wanted to interrogate him who was so damn good at this, and he would have been far better. But they ended up with some guy who was a bit shit, and he balled it up, really. I mean, they wanted to believe that this guy was the guy. I really think that in some ways.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, they the questions really led him.
He was definitely led down the path.
Yeah.
Although he did also have and volunteer information
Absolutely.
that only the killer would know, or the killer had fed to him in their prison cell.
Or you have a photographic memory and you've seen a photo in the news, but it's not been shown to you in that room.
No. So Marianne Sullivan's nephew.
Yep.
In investigating this, and now Phil Di Natale's sons, who have kind of taken this on for themselves as well.
Yes.
They both say that there were things that they know categorically were never released to the media that he knew.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
In
that
terms
there was
of photos and and then the police were then able to back up with crime scene photos.
One particular one was released. That under a chair was a packet of Marlboro cigarettes. And they did ask him in the interview, was there something under the chair? So that's leading as there's something there.
Yeah.
But what?
What is it?
And he said, oh, there was a packet of Marlboro cigarettes, but I don't smoke that brand, so I pushed them under the chair. And there was another one in that same scene where he knew that she was on her period.
Yeah.
And they'd said there was something else next to the body, and he goes, oh yeah, a tampon, I'd pull that out first. So, yeah, just awful. But he knew, though, there was particularly those two bits of evidence. They said only the killer would know.
Yeah. So there was another thing that I thought was really interesting. So the photos were in black and white. In the crime scene photos. And in one of his accounts, I can't remember which murder it was, but he was like, oh, the couch was brown.
Yep.
I think.
Blue.
Oh, blue.
Blue. Yeah.
The couch was blue. But the victim in her statement had said that her couch was brown. And when so they couldn't tell by the photos, they actually went back and had a look at the couch, and turns out he was right. Yeah. She'd gotten the couch, colour of her couch wrong. Yeah. So, there were things like that kind of really did add up to him going, oh, okay, well, all these things kind of check out.
But there were certain things he got really wrong too.
This is the thing.
Yeah.
So there were certain crime scenes where he nailed every aspect of it. There were other crime scenes where he didn't.
Yeah.
He had the positioning of furniture in the wrong space.
Well, he actually said that those first victims where we said that they weren't raped, they were sexually assaulted with objects. He said he had raped them, and that's not what. So the cops knew that that's not what happened in those scenes. So that was a real. To me, that's where there's that. I think he can be linked to certain ones, but there's certain ones he can't be. And then,
so are you basing that on the fact that there was no semen found?
There was no semen found, and they could tell by what was how they've been raped.
How did they tell?
Can they not?
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm just thinking if he hadn't, what if he'd raped them but not actually to the point where.
But he never mentioned that he used objects with them at all.
Right.
That was never brought up in his statements.
Although in the statement about Marianne Sullivan, he did confess to using a broom handle.
That's right. So
okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Those first ones, he did not know that he was never mentioned that there were objects used in those ones.
Yeah, okay.
He only ever said that he raped them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where I kind of go.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
There's a suggestion that perhaps he had multiple personalities and one personality committed the rapes for the older women, another personality committed the rapes for the younger women. One of them did the sexual assaulting with an object, the other one did the sexual assaulting with a penis.
Freaks me out. Because the one personality doesn't know what the other personality did. Is that
well, that's the inference.
That whole oh, yeah.
But then obviously if that was the case, he's had something in him because there was enough similarity between all of these crimes to link them in some way. That's just, one thing that I've heard.
Yeah.
Whether it's true or not.
Yeah.
Getting back to the reporting of this though. So if you watch the latest movie that we were talking about with Keira Knightley, it's centered around the Record American newspaper, which was the first newspaper to kind of put all of these crimes together and come up with a name.
Yeah.
And two female journalists were at the absolute cutting edge of this. And you go, girls, because in the 60s, you can imagine. So in the newsroom, they were doing lifestyle and reviewing toasters and, beauty products. And look, I got my hair cut in this certain way. And the two journalists named Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole, they were dogged. They did not give up, and they were incredible women.
Yeah.
And they're the ones, I think they ended up writing like in the hundreds of columns about the Boston Strangler, but they're the ones who put it together and actually named the Boston Strangler the Boston Strangler.
Yeah, because I think there was other news articles that were using the Mad Strangler and that
or
sort of
lots
thing.
of different things, or the silk scarf strangler or something like that.
Boston Strangler's way better name.
Yeah, absolutely. But they were, career women in a time with children in a time where, that just didn't happen.
Yeah.
It just didn't happen. But, they were incredible. Loretta McLaughlin then went on to the Boston Globe, and she was editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe by the end of her career.
Wow.
I believe she's recently passed away within the last few years.
Yeah.
But she lived into her 90s. Just an incredible woman. But yeah, so the movie really sort of centers around her and how she how the story came about. It's a really, really cool story.
Yeah.
The rest of the cases, I guess, aside from Mary Ann Sullivan, remain open to this day.
Yeah. So because Albert was never convicted of any of the Boston Strangler murders, even the one that we know he committed based on DNA, Mary Ann Sullivan. But because so he was as we said, he was actually in Bridgewater, and he escaped. But he ended up turning himself in.
Only 24 hours later or something. He escaped with two other inmates.
Yeah.
And 24 hours later, it was like, oh, hi.
But yeah, so then they didn't put him back into Bridgewater then. They put him into Walpole instead. He went, so then he was in jail, not in the hospital. And I think it was 6 years later, he was murdered. We still don't know who murdered him. So there's another little question mark. And
he was stabbed to death in his cell. Back in what would have been the 70s, there was no CCTV or anything like that within the prisons, and I guess don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah.
Like no one was going to fess up to it or say that they saw anything.
But just to keep that question mark over all of it, so he had, the day before his murder from the prison, had rung his psychologist, who he had worked extensively with a psychologist. I think they were all like, let me at this brain. I want to find out how this thing works. He had this really close relationship with a psychologist, and he had rung him the day before to say, and the guy had said, look, if you want to speak to me, that's great. I'll come down tomorrow. And his words to this psychologist on the phone were, I want to tell you the truth.
He actually even said it is urgent.
Yeah. He was really, really adamant he needed to speak to him.
Yeah.
And so the thought is that he was going to confess that the confession was false and that he wasn't the Boston Strangler of all the murders potentially.
Yeah.
And this is prior to anyone knowing that he definitely killed Mary Ann Sullivan.
Yeah.
Because that was too early.
Yeah.
But so at this point the thought is that he was going to say something around whether or not he did or didn't do certain crimes. But he was murdered the very next day. So did NASA put a hit out on him? Because he was going to go, it's not me, it's George NASA.
But I mean, what would George NASA have to gain? He was sentenced to life in prison as well.
Too, yeah, but I don't know. I think it was he's an interesting person. If you watched any of the interviews with him, he's an interesting bloke for sure.
Yeah.
So whether or not, different criminals, some of them want to own up to everything and confess to things they didn't do. Others never want to be caught. Maybe it's
more a matter
different
of pride
motivation
or something. Absolutely.
And being known for certain things.
Just really quickly going back to the taped recordings that you can listen to and watch. Do you find Albert DeSalvo's voice doesn't match his physical stature?
Not at all.
I look at him.
He's a short man.
I know, but even still, like his voice is
really high pitched, and with that Boston accent.
Yeah, and
with
it's
it,
like
it was,
really it's really sort of juvenile.
Yeah.
I found that really fascinating.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, I found him really interesting.
Yeah,
for sure.
So I think that kind of brings us to the end. There's not much more to say in conclusion to this. We'll never know now.
No, he's dead. I mean, they've got his DNA in terms of, exhuming the body, like, so that obviously if anything changes in the future in terms of being able to test anything from previous crime scenes, but there's just nothing there collected because they didn't have the thought process of what might come at that point, of DNA testing and things. It was just fortunate that they had Mary Ann Sullivan's DNA on the blanket. It wasn't like they'd collected it purposefully in that sense to go, hey, we might be able to do something like this with this in the future. So, I mean, really, I don't know that we're ever going to...
There's no other physical evidence that's been collected that they can test against. No. So I think,
other than George Nasser, who, oh God, is he still alive?
He died in 2017.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah, so he's gone as well, so... Yeah. Yeah.
So I just don't think we're ever going to know the answer. No. But we're really interested to see what other people think. So definitely. Please let us know. Yeah.
And let's hope that we have, I mean, I know definitely, I want more cops like Phil Donatale. But I know I think his sons are all cops as well and stuff. So
I don't know how many sons he's got, but I know two of them are.
Yeah. So I hope that they, by all accounts, they seem to be as good as their dad and as gung-ho as him to find the baddie. So,
and as dogged. In order to be an investigator, you just couldn't let it go, and I don't think he ever let it go.
I think, to be honest, I think he died. He became quite ill and he did pass away, Phil Donatale, before it was known that he was right and that Albert DeSalvo certainly was involved in the Boston Strangling murders. But, I know his sons all, kind of, feel vindicated for their dad that he was on the right track, that's for sure. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Let us know what you think.
Yes.
And as we say every week, please like and subscribe to our channel. So hit the follow button on whatever podcast app you're listening to. It really, really helps us get our podcast out to more and more people, and that it's been steadily growing. So thank you to everybody who's done that so far. We feel really like it's just great to see that it's growing every week, and it really motivates us to keep going and keep the episodes coming along. Next week, we will be releasing an episode about Karen Rostevsky. So this is it's a horrible situation.
Yeah.
But stay tuned for that next week. And thank you for joining us again.
That is for sure. Stay curious, crime besties.
Bye.